Welcome to a special Christmas edition of Book Talk. As our contribution to the festive fun, our distinguished panel will be offering you their selection of the best political books from what's been a rollicking political year. With me for this labour, and it's a small L, labour of love, are two of the Commons' most entertaining performers. Stephen Pound, who demonstrated his mastery of pathos in 1997 with a maiden speech describing his fruitless quest to find some historical anecdote or famous name to link to his Ealing constituency. And Jacob Rees Mogg, a member of the new Tory intake, who enlivens humdrum debates on private members' bills with quotations from Cicero, and who urged the Prime Minister to imitate a tiger rather than Bagpuss at EU summits, with results we all see. And as our token non-MP, the Parliamentary Press Gallery's mistress of the deadpan skewer, if you can have such a thing, Ann Treneman, political sketchwriter of The Times. And Stephen, your offering is The West End Front, the story of how it wasn't all rationing and shared sacrifice in wartime, in the Second World War, in the great hotels.
Well, absolutely not. I mean, Quentin Crisp said that London during the Second World War was like a huge, heaving double bed. And I wasn't there, and I don't know, but I'll take Quentin Crisp's word for it. However, what we do know, thanks to this amazing book by Matthew Sweet, and this book, it's more than just a book. This is like the perfect brand tub, the perfect Christmas stocking, bulging with 101 delights. I mean, ostensibly, it's about the four major, the huge West End hotels, about what went on, and, extraordinary stories like Claridge's, where one room in Claridge's is declared to be Serbian soil for half an hour in order that the Queen of Serbia can give birth to the child who then became King Carol of Yugoslavia, on Serbian soil. But it's also a list of all these amazing people, including, I challenge anyone to come up with a character like Dr. Lee Vaughan Henry, who spent the First War in a prisoner of war camp. He then wrote the national anthem for the uninhabited Caribbean island of Redonda, wrote a badly received play about the organist John Bull, supplied ballet pieces for the Ania Spong dancers, and then, if that were not enough, became musical director of the British Union of Fascists, and was interned in a circus winter quarter in Kent. Look, this book is amazing. It's about, if anything, it's a sort of book that you almost wish was 50 books, because you will go on and read another one. It's the extraordinary characters, the people like Arthur Lewis, who was the trade union leader who was trying to actually stop the Savoy staying open, because there was a great tension during the war when people in the hotels were having the time of their lives and everybody outside was starving.
Yeah. Well, wasn't the point that they didn't have food rationing at all in those hotels?
Well, no, indeed there wasn't, and how they got away with it. I mean, the Savoy was actually a self-contained island. It had its own power supply, it had its own water supply, it had its own farms, had an enormous stuff.
It's had its own sort of version of MI5 sitting.
Oh, it did. They had their own
table.
Indeed, they did.
Yeah.
But it was very much like Gormenghast when you read it. In Gormenghast, these people called the Grey Scrubbers who spent all their lives cleaning the walls of the kitchen, and so they kind of transmogrified, if I can use the word, into sort of neo-stone themselves. But there's people who'd worked there for generation after generation, and of course at the beginning of the war, because so many of them were Italian or Swiss or German, they were immediately interned. And then you get the great tensions. But this is extraordinary things. I mean, some of it is quite tragic. I mean, there were sort of illegal abortions taking place in some of the hotels. Half the royal families of Europe seem to be fleeing with their crown jewels under one arm. And in the case of King Zog of Albania, a large suitcase full of specie. And there's a lovely bit in here where Matthew Sweet goes with King Zog's grandson back to Albania after the fall of the Soviet Union and tries to negotiate with the de facto rebel leader, who's an ex-cigarette smuggler called Albert Scheidt, who will not allow any of the Zogs back.
It's full of totally unbelievable fact after totally unbelievable fact. I was reading this saying life used to be so much more colourful.
Did it strike you, Jacob, as a social comment in a way, that there was something in there about how we weren't all equal in that great moment of struggle for the country?
Yeah, but yes and no, because we'd become more equal. That one of the first things that happened in the Savoy was that the general manager took off his top hat and tailcoat and started wearing a lounge suit. That there was a coming together, but still there was much more comfort in the Savoy than there was outside.
And there was also a certain amount of intrigue. There seemed to be a little bit of sort of spying as well as all these crown heads revolving around.
It was MI5's Home Office. I mean, but on Jacob's point, there's one of the waiters said in 1945, at the end of the war, somebody snaps his finger for the waiter, and he turns and says, "Oh, I'm sorry, sir, have you mislaid your dog?" And that was, in some ways, that was the end of deference. Because, if deference ended at the Savoy, it ended everywhere. But no, spies used to absolutely love it, and they sort of drift in and out of
but
this.
The spies aren't any good, are they? They think that
they're
everybody...
sitting in the bar in a corner called the spies corner.
That's right. They know who the spies are. They follow people who aren't doing anything at all and intern them for no very good reason because they've heard a snippet from somebody who didn't like them, from a disgruntled wife and things like that. The whole spying racket is just so amazingly incompetent and expensive.
There's some lovely ones that they've retrieved from Kew there. They're talking about people who were actually arrested and followed. In many cases, they have 4 or 5 people following them because we suspected he was a person of loose morals. And
surely not.
And there's a woman there who said we cannot transcribe what she said because her language was indescribely filthy.
Her life is incredible.
Well, that's Lonsdale. I mean, she was the most amazing character in the book.
There's one man...
She deserves a book of her own, I think. She probably has a book of her own somewhere, but anyway.
So there's a man who pays the bus fare for the spies who are following him because they haven't got any money on them. It's all completely ridiculous.
It is, isn't it, the most extraordinary set of almost surreal anecdotes. It seems sometimes more like Monty Python than real life, but it was apparently real life.
But don't you think you could find extraordinary goings-on now? It doesn't actually need to be in wartime. And the big strike in the Savoy is actually long after the war has ended. And it's just a comment on the fact that there are people who lead eccentric lives. And they are attracted to the great hotels because they have such a large number passing through them.
I definitely think you have those characters in the hotels. I mean, whenever I go visit them, you see these people and they do seem larger than life. But I think to have sort of the tragedy of the war going on at the same time as people trying to keep up appearances and...
Well, it's no coincidence that the great model for the portmanteau novel is the hotel. You've got Arnold Bennett, you've got Vicky Baum, Grand Hotel, you've got any number of... which then became films in the 1950s, 1960s. You remember Airport and Grand Hotel and all these ones. It's the perfect place to bring everybody together. What's amazing about West End Front and about the hotels there were things that I had never heard of, like the Duchess rate, where a Duchess could come in and actually end up paying peanuts for this sort of marvellous suite for which the Crown Prince of Serbia could have been bored in for.
Rate.
Well, if any, I have to say, you should have.
I haven't been offered it.
Well, and your book offers no less soap opera in a way. You've chosen The Unfinished Revolution, which is an updated version of a book by Lord Gould, the late Philip Gould, who was Labour's great political strategist and opinion pollster, one of the founding figures of New Labour. And it has even more soap opera in it, perhaps, than...
I just think that this book manages to put... I think Lord Gould was brilliant at putting emotion. I think he was a very emotional man, and I think he writes about his life. Basically, he sees his life as the reason for New Labour existing, that... that he was part of the sort of lower middle class, that sort of classic Labour voters that no one sort of was paying any attention to anymore, and wanting to do better in life, and no one wanted their vote. I don't know. I just found it very moving, and I also found, I mean, obviously there's quite a lot about focus groups in here, which may not be so riveting for other people. But when you think about it, a focus group is asking people what they think, and quite often in the old politics they just thought, well, this is what people should think, so this is what. And that's another thing where Labour went wrong, because they thought, well, the people should want revolution, should want socialism. Well, actually, it turned out they didn't. They wanted something a little more close to home.
It's a lovely book, and describing being a Labour Party activist in Woking, I think it's a great book in itself, and it's a bit like John O'Farrell's Things Can Only Get Better. But there's, as somebody who was there. I was there, and there's a line in here which resonates wonderfully. Just after we got mullered in 1992, and a person I should not embarrass them by mentioning, it was fairly well known at the time. He said, "The people have rejected us for the 4th time. What's wrong with them?" This old style. The electorate have rejected us. Get another electorate.
Yeah.
And we were so delusional. And Philip Gould was one of the key people in there. Without Gould, without Mandelson, without Blair, none of this would have happened.
He has a tremendous romance about politics that you often just do not get with the technocrats and the real, the nerd. But I think he's very romantic. I really think he writes about politics in a way that people usually don't. And so I think it's quite and from what I hear, David Cameron's team really studied it. And I think this might be responsible for that husky picture. Trying to see how you change your image, how you change your party's image. But I think it's just, I just found
Would you like to read? I mean, after I finished this, I thought I'd quite like to read a biography of Philip Gould, because there's a wonderful thing there. His family came from Bournemouth originally. His father was known as Golden Gould because he was such a good footballer, and he's actually got bits of the local paper saying Golden Gould scores again. And his father wasn't just a good footballer; he was a very good cricketer. And there's a whole, and his sister, Philip Gould's sister, was absolute stone genius. I mean, she was off the scale. And I would very, very much like to see how that family mechanism, and of course, obviously, the next generation of the family are involved in politics. But it's a great book, but it's also one to read, I think, in connection with the Gould biography when it comes out, which it surely will.
But Jacob, do you suspect that your party's current leadership has read this book and conjured up a kind of mirror image revival project for the Conservatives?
It's a very dangerous thing if they have. I mean, I thought the book was fascinating. I thought Philip Gould himself came across, as Anne says, as a romantic figure, a believer in big political ideas and then the means of getting them implemented by others. But that he often seems to think that some little focus group has changed the mind of the country rather than the fact that the major government wasn't governing at all well. And it seemed to me that sometimes the obsession with the detail made him miss the big picture. So, to answer your question, I think if the Cameron team have followed this, they've made a mistake, because it was absolutely perfect, that discipline, the spin and everything that went with it for a totally dysfunctional Labour Party in the 1990s. But I'm not sure that trying to repeat it for the Tory Party would actually be the right answer.
And Anne, the bit that had me sort of hand over mouth aghast was reading all the goings-on in election campaigns where secret committees were concocting the strategy while nobody was looking, and decisions would pop into existence without people quite knowing where they came from, because it was all one big conspiracy against other conspiracies.
Despair-making, and just makes you just think they're all a bunch of 11-year-old girls running around talking about each other's backs.
That's a little unfair to 11-year-old girls.
I mean, it's just incredible. But, I mean, that is kind of politics, you know.
And what's extraordinary is that actually locked us into a straitjacket for years. Remember, after 1997, we had agreed, the Labour Party, sorry, I'm the only person here in the Labour, the Labour Party had agreed to actually stick with Ken Clarke's sort of financial forecast for 2 years and their discipline. It was all part of it. We were so terrified. But for me, that perfect bit in here is where the Daily Mail or somebody starts attacking the Labour Party. It's a bunch of immoral so-and-sos. And Mandelson sits back in his chair and says, "Get me a bishop." and you know, genius, you know. I mean, Machiavelli, thou shouldst be living, you know, maestro.
He is helped by his characters, which are all amazing.
Did Peter Mandelson actually exist, do you think? Was there ever such a person?
Yeah.
It's a truly wonderful moment.
I miss him.
But is there an element in this that actually the British people seem to want to be governed in a certain sort of way, and it seems to be the task of political reformers in either the Labour Party or the Conservative Party to forge their party into that mould from whichever side they come, that everybody's being made almost the same, Jake?
No, I think if you look at Margaret Thatcher, and actually if you look at Tony Blair, there is a great determination to change the country to their way of thinking, rather than just operating within the bounds that have been set. And I think Tony Blair did leave a very different Britain from the one he found, as Margaret Thatcher had. I mean, I rather think we've now got to change it back again, because what he did didn't work, but that's a separate point. I think there were underlying ideas that they wanted to get through, and they thought they could get them through by selling them in such a way that the electorate appreciated, and that required focus groups to understand how best to phrase the message rather than to determine the message.
Stephen, what do you think? Do you think the Labour Party was kind of stretched into an unnatural shape by the Philip Gould and Tony Blair and the whole new Labour Politburo?
Not really. I mean, the Politburo is not the expression I would have automatically used at the time. I mean, focus group's perfectly acceptable expression. It was more of a colloquium than anything like that. Yeah, look, what it was waking up and smelling the coffee. It was dragging us out of the inward-looking lager that we know, the sort of the circular firing squad, which had been Labour for years and years and years, where it's far easier and more fun to fight each other than to, you know, and let the Tories roll on. So, but the point about the unfinished revolution about that is exactly what Jacob was just saying. It's Blair's point about public sector reform, public service reform. That is the unfinished revolution. When Blair talked about the consumer, not the producer, solely, then it's that whole argument there which we still have to resolve.
I think there's just one thing to say, which is that the press were always saying how much Labour hated each other, how they were always lying.
Oh, we did.
And nobody believed that it could possibly be as bad as this. And then you read these books and discover it was worse, which I think is absolutely fascinating.
Now, Jacob, you've chosen infighting of a rather more exalted vintage. You've got the new biography of Lord Castlereagh, the early 19th century statesman who carved up Europe after Napoleon, was seen as the greatest ever British Foreign Secretary by some, was seen as a terrible repressive figure, a clamper down on enlightenment by others, and even fought a duel with a future Prime Minister at one point in Putney Heath.
He didn't. He gave Canning a nasty flesh wound. It's absolutely extraordinary. At least in the Gould book, the cabinet ministers are shouting at each other, whereas in 1809, I think it was, they went and shot at each other, and they were both very senior ministers.
I thought the duel thing. I was thinking, is that going to work if we update that? You know, can we do that?
Mobile phones, it's just not the same, is it?
No.
It was not the same, but they were very passionate. Castlereagh was clearly a very passionate man, believed what he believed very strongly. He was in government for a very long time. He's first appointed in Ireland, I think, in 1797, and dies in 1822. And he is in office for almost all of that period, which nowadays is unthinkable, that somebody who's been in office for 10 years has had a very lengthy political career. He does some things which he gets completely right. He's absolutely crucial in supplying Wellington in the peninsula and making sure that that's successful.
Fighting against Napoleon and all.
That's right, and ensuring that the supplies are there after Torres Vedras, so that the troops can eat whilst the French, when they come in, find scorched earth in front of them. He's crucial in his support of Wellington. Then Vienna is highly arguable as to whether it was either peace for 100 years or set up a system that was bound to fail and was very illiberal. In my view, it's basically dealing with the situation as it was.
This is after the fall of Napoleon, when
after the fall, but as Napoleon's
Europe.
falling, interestingly, that they're holding the discussions, and Napoleon then suddenly escapes from Elba, so they've got to suspend the discussions for a bit whilst he starts marching through France.
Metternich starts hovering in the doorways, unsure as to where
Well,
to
Metternich is such an interesting figure, and the relationship between Castlereagh and Metternich is surprisingly close. They seem to
In fact, if
understand
Metternich's
each other.
daughter hadn't died in the middle of it, who knows what would have happened? Because Metternich then absents himself at the key moment.
Key moment. That's right. He's
This is
off about 12 days.
the Austro-Hungarian foreign minister, the
Obviously, it's
other
not
side
Sid
of
Metternich, the Bristol City fullback, is it?
I was very taken with the role of poets in this book. I mean, they are kind of like the bloggers of their day. I mean, amazingly vituperative.
And the poets hate Castlereagh, don't they?
Totally.
Much more than anybody else. That they don't hate Pitt, they don't hate Canning, they don't hate Liverpool, but Castlereagh is loathed. And I wonder whether that's because he was effective, and therefore they thought he was the man to attack, and that Liverpool was a slightly detached figure. Canning was a very mercurial figure, and Pitt obviously had died.
Was an irrelevance,
well, Percival was dead.
But the point, but when he was alive, they didn't. I think the point is, a lot of the people. I mean, you're right about the vituperation. I mean, everybody knows that I met murder on the way. But there's an even more unpleasant couplet about his grave, which is quite foul. But I think in some ways it's because Castlereagh, as a young man, was such a modernist. He was a sort of new Labour bloke, sort of 1790s. He's very much part of the Enlightenment. You know what I mean. He was a very modern politician. He was not a conservative politician by any possible stretch of the imagination.
Crucially, he's in Paris or near Paris in 1792.
It's Burke all over again. Burke, when he looks into the mouth of the beast, he recoils in horror.
But unlike Burke, he's not for restoring the Bourbons necessarily. He's not for the status quo ante.
Now there's a book.
He is for a developed settlement.
Exactly.
And he's therefore, he remains quite modern in some respects, but he recognises, as I think most people now do, the excesses of the French Revolution.
He was there for the terror, the executions,
that's right.
People fleeing for their lives.
He knows
not just the aristocrats.
Oh, yeah. I think there's a new... Do you remember when, a few years ago, people used to start writing books for and about Lyndon Johnson, and we had the Caro-Dalek Wars. I mean, which was seriously, war through the proxy of biographers. Everybody knows Lyndon Johnson was one of the greatest ever peacetime presidents of the United States, one of the finest politicians who ever lived. But you started getting these different... With what Bue's done here, and Bue is, above all, a very, very fine historian, very thorough and an extremely good writer who tells a damn good story. This is, I think, the first one of the Rehabilitate Castlereagh books, because it does rehabilitate him.
It makes him appear to be a really serious and important figure.
I thought that he had...
Exactly.
I quite enjoy it. I think he's very good at detail, isn't he? And just... He has this one part where he's just talking about his amazing social life, which is apart from the politics. And so they all went to the opera, like virtually every night. And then the parties began till 2 or 3. And then they all went off sort of 4 o'clock to bed. They got up by noon. This House of Commons didn't sit, obviously, till the middle of the night. And then breakfast lasted till 6 p.m. I mean, I'm not making this up. And I was totally taken with this because it just sort of comes alive in the book, doesn't it?
And the extraordinary pressure of doing this because he's got to do work, whereas a lot of the people at these parties don't have any work to do.
Nobody really knows why he cut his throat in 1822. Nobody really knows. There were all the rumours at the time, but I mean, having read this and having gone back and read a few other things, I think sheer exhaustion has got to be a factor.
You've been in office for 25 years.
Yeah.
It's got to take something out of you.
The social life. I mean, just keeping up with the whole activities.
I was very taken out with the point you were making about how poets were terribly influential then, but they also seem, the Young-Castle seem to have been terribly influenced by a whole series of romantic novels about modernism and moving to a better world that wasn't quite as repressive and horrible. And do you yearn for an era when writers have that much clout?
Yes, frankly.
I'm talking to a writer who does.
I think sketch writers do.
Yeah,
but I mean,
absolutely.
I would, you know, now we have sort of the poet laureate, we have poetry, but we don't have the sort of real sort of anger where everyone is talking about it and people are reading it and, you know, just, I mean, I would love that. I would love if we had, but you do poetry in the chamber sometimes. I just love it.
I get into trouble for it, but I think sketch writers can destroy politicians' careers by, I mean, the Vulcan and John Redwood phrase is something a formidably able man has had hanging around his neck for 20 years.
He's
to
had to
his
change
disadvantage.
the whole way he blinks, I think.
Well, I'll talk of another formidably able man now. My choice is The Importance of Being Awkward, the new set of memoirs from Tam Dalyell, who I suppose is probably going to be remembered longer than many people who were ministers, even though he never achieved office. He was a formidable backbench antagonist who must have driven generations of ministers absolutely mad with frustration as he kept on bombarding them with nearly impossible questions. He's obviously left Parliament in 2005. He's retired to his ancestral home, the House of the Bins, overlooking...
The Bins just means the hills. It's like, it's a Gaelic Ben Nevis. It's the same origin. It's nothing to do with loony bins. It just means the two hills.
But Bins is like a major character in the book.
Yes, indeed.
I felt exactly. Bins was a person.
Oh, yeah.
This has been the home to generations of DLs ever since, I think, a parliamentarian general in the Civil War.
No, he's a cavalier.
A cavalier general. I'm so sorry, a cavalier.
Please.
He was on the right side.
It was on the wrong side.
Well, I don't think we'll refight that.
Everyone agrees.
On guard.
But Stephen, you've obviously sat on the Labour benches when Tam Dalyell was there as the father of the House, the longest-serving MP. Did he leave a vast impression upon you?
Extraordinarily. He first of all, he was one of the most extraordinary, interesting people you could ever meet. And he just after I got elected, he came up to me and he said just a word of advice. And he told me the story, which appears in here, about just after he'd been elected, somebody wrote to him from Linlithgow complaining about canine faeces in the Memorial Park. So he writes to the provost or somebody or other, who then writes back to him the letter every MP dreams of getting. You know, dog shit is my business, Mr. Dalyell. Westminster is yours. You know, which he just longed for. But the other extraordinary thing was, I used to give him a lift home quite often. He lived in Horseferry Road. I'd drive him back to Ealing and I'd drop him off. And people who never spoke to him didn't realise this. He was fascinated by football. He loved football. He would go miles out of his way. And his London team was Fulham. And he used to tell me stories about Tosh Chamberlain and Johnny Haynes. It's absolutely incredible. In fact, in the book, there's a few times where he's wandering off somewhere and he decides to go and look at see a football match. He's in Russia and he said, "Oh, you know, our locomotive Moscow." Oh, what's that? He was an extraordinary character, and everybody remembers him for the Chagos Islands and all that. But above all, people remember him for a degree of erudition that's stunning. It's only when you read his book and you realise that his ancestor, General Tam, not only escaped from the Tower of London, but commanded the forces of Tsar Nikolaevich, who was the father of Peter the Great, at the gates of Smolensk, which was why he was known as Russian Tam, but sort of comes back and is one of the most powerful military figures. And yet also, you know, and one of his other relatives was the greatest expert in the world on the reproductive organs of the common leech. Now, how many of us can say that?
Yeah, I think none of us can say that.
Did you ever sketch him out?
Yes. Oh, yes. He's very sketchable. Yes. He was father of the house. So.
What caught your sketch writer's eye?
He did have the most marvellous way of talking. It was very ponderous. I mean, at times the book is a bit ponderous, and I think he actually is writing as he speaks. He has a lot of pauses, but he always, I mean, the thing I sort of really liked about is his passionate interest in issues and sort of principles, which was one of the reasons he was interesting to sketch, especially during Iraq, of course. He was a voice who was totally unafraid of power. He was completely believed he was right, which is the kind of confidence possibly you get from going to Eton, I don't know.
An inspiration to you, Jake?
I thought it was very interesting how enthusiastic he was about his ancestors. I thought as a long-standing socialist that ancestor worship wouldn't form part of his background, and how important winning the fourth form classics prize at Eton was to him, which gets mentioned several times in the book. And you do wonder, he must be 80, how come this 14-year-old prize has remained so important? It doesn't just get a passing mention, it gets repeated. And I love biographies that tell you about what's formed people and where they feel they've been successful and how that's resonated throughout their lives. And it's as if it was at that point he realised he was quite clever if he stuck to things and decided that that was what he was going to make his career out of.
I can still remember him. Towards the end of his time in the house, he always carried a rubber ring around with him and sat on it for various reasons that need not detain us. And he left one day when Michael Martin was speaking. I can remember Michael Martin said, "Mr. DL, you've left your rubber ring behind." And anybody else would have been embarrassed. I mean, Tam, like a great stately galleon, sort of floated back to the second bench from the back where he used to sit and be like, "Oh, thank you," and sort of acknowledge the young gilly because he was incredibly grand. And to read this book, you over and over again, all these people he was at school with, who now is, of course, one of the finest plastic surgeons in the universe.
They all are.
I mean, there's a picture of him in some ghastly club at Eton where they go around torturing working class kids. I don't know, whatever they do at Eton. There's a list of all of them underneath. I mean, one of them's dead. The rest of them are the masters of the universe.
I know.
But is it just too easy to dismiss him as an eccentric, someone who had this bizarre background?
No. What he did, don't forget, after Tam came into the house, he and a man called Dr. Dixon Mabon, the two of them, they both came in the early 60s. And it was strange that when he was made a PPS, his job was to actually cook the breakfast for his minister at the time, which I think is rather marvellous. But he and Dixon Mabon decided very early on that there was no science that took place in the House of Commons. Nobody had an interest in it. There was no proper committees. Nobody had any interest in it. So they started bombarding Parliament with these questions about, particularly, Tam was fantastically fond of nuclear power because he had been down the pits and he said nobody should ever have to do that. And he then had an article in New Scientist for 38 years. He wrote on a different subject. He was a scientist.
Well, I think independent-minded backbenchers are a thoroughly good thing, and the more of them, the better. But a model, I think in terms of a model, sticking to subjects where you're convinced that you're right is clearly an important thing to do. Perhaps he took things to extremes.
In what sense?
Well, sometimes he wasn't right, and therefore he banged on about things like the Belgrane. There is an enemy ship near you, you're at war, you sink it. Seems to me very straightforward and not worth 10 years of campaigning about. But that may be a Tory perspective.
Well, of course, he's such a perfect character for the sketch writer's art, and indeed we have here two other perfect characters for the sketch writer's art.
Favourites.
And I want to try and move us on a little bit, just to talk about what it's like in the House of Commons, what the quality of the oratory is like these days, amongst other things. The quality of the place. It seems very different now in the last year and a half or so since Parliament reconvened after the election. Do you find yourself caught by the sudden change in atmosphere?
I think it's livened up a lot. The new intake was like a breath of fresh air, and I'm not just saying that because I always think of you as a character from the past. It has to be said, but it's still a breath of fresh air. And yes, I think people. Obviously, the people are younger and they have more passions and they're more interested in that. And also, I think the Speaker has changed things a lot. You know, we have more urgent questions. He is much more interested in getting what's happening, the conversation happening out in the country, also happening in the House of Commons. And before, often the two did not go together. as much as they should have.
Jacob, is there a sense that we're perhaps seeing a resurgence of proper old-style parliamentarianism rather than some new postmodern version of it?
Well, I think coalition makes Parliament more important, because there isn't a single party with a huge majority. Therefore, winning the argument matters, because you've got to persuade your own party to make compromises and the other party to come along with you. And so that's why I think the last 18 months have been good for the House of Commons. But I agree with Anne, the Speaker has also been good for Parliament, because he's keen to hold the government to account and made their life a little bit difficult.
And you're one of the figures in the chamber who does an awful lot of speaking. You're usually there with a question or a speech, a 25-minute speech on the London Local Authorities Bill in the recent past, which has left its scars on many of those who watched. Is oratory coming back as well in the chamber?
I don't know. I mean, I assume there's always been oratory in the chamber, and that it's always been said to be dying. I mean, we go back to Pitt, and people were saying there'll never be the likes of Pitt as a speaker again. And then it's Disraeli and Gladstone, and then Enoch Powell, and then there's William Hague. So there's always somebody coming along who can speak in the chamber.
I mean, Anne, your book, Dave and Nick, the unhappy marriage of the coalition, as you're describing it in your sketches,
getting ever unhappier.
is out at the moment. I mean, do you focus on the orators, or do you perhaps pick on the non-orators sometimes?
Well, I think everyone can become an orator at certain points in their life. I mean, and also, I also am quite interested. I mean, I'm waiting for Ed Miliband to become an orator. Maybe waiting some time. Yeah. Yes, but I am quite interested in the relationships. I think the relationships are quite. The coalition obviously makes Dave and Nick quite fascinating and on all sorts of levels to watch. But now you see, Ed Miliband is also they're all now, because it's coalition. Over Europe, Ed will undoubtedly try and get Nick to agree with him on this. So I think we're heading in towards an even more interesting phase, and it is kind of interesting.
Look, oratory is dead on the floor of the House. I know I'm getting old when I say this.
But you are funny.
Yeah,
you are very funny.
Oratory is dead. Recitation rules. People now stand up with electronic devices and read speeches.
No,
they do. Sure. Some of them have borrows.
It cannot be.
Yeah. No, they can't even use a decent quill pen. The bounders.
I think you can still make a good speech with an iPad.
Yeah, but very, very much now the move is towards how it appears outside the House. Things that people say. Alan Johnson was making a speech the other day, and he essayed a jest that didn't go down very well, and he said, completely off the cuff, it worked really well in the bathroom this morning when I spoke to the mirror. And it was, at the time, it was very, very funny. Outside, it would look dreadful. And I think people are now conscious, because there's a mechanism nowadays where people can put words into telephones and send them around the universe almost within seconds.
Through electric telephone.
Do you have a mobile device?
They're very popular, Your Honour, with the classes. But Anne, let me put you on the spot. Let me put you on the spot here and see if you could give your two colleagues here marks out of 10 for artistic impression and technical merit as Commons performers. That's an act of sadism, but go on.
Artistic, do you know when Jacob stands up, he receives cheers from all around the house?
Jacob doesn't stand up, he uncoils.
You do uncoil. I always think of you when you're doing that, I imagine it's like watching Abe Lincoln sort of gradually, bits of you stand up before other bits.
I was thinking of a python, but yeah, I mean, I'll give you Abe Lincoln.
But I'm always interested because you always have thought carefully about what you're going to say. And that actually matters. A lot of people don't. A lot of people are just spouting. And of course, I must admit, I'm always expecting you to be funny. Sometimes you aren't funny. Sometimes you're serious. And that's even more interesting, because I think, he's going against his inner grain, his inner jester. Anyway.
If I laugh at any mortal thing, it is only lest I weep.
Well, on that note, I'm afraid.
Happy Christmas, one and all!
Ho, ho, ho.
Our time is at an end. It only remains for me to thank my guests, Ann Treneman, Jacob Rees Mogg and Stephen Pound, and to wish them and all our viewers from all of us at BBC Parliament a Merry Christmas and a Parliamentary New Year.
Thank you.